Good evening and welcome to the Joko, as we're meeting an hour earlier than we ordinarily do, and trying to make the adjustment in real time. I am Brother Youssef. With me is Sister Tasha, members of the Joko Collective. And tonight we're going to continue our discussion of this attack on science and scientific inquiry that we see in this moment of political reaction in this country. The let's see, we lost Tasha for a second, but now we have Tasha back. Hi, Tasha.
Hello, hello. Greetings, everybody.
What was that?
Interesting double play thing going on, echo thing. And so I don't know exactly how this is coming out. So I think I'm going to exit. It clears up my exit. If I can figure it out, I'll hop back on. And you
Uh, do you think it has something to do with the present or invite window that is open? Or that's in the studio? Because I hear the kind of echo, or sometimes you're a little underwater.
Yeah, and I don't understand that.
Not anymore now. But I do see, there's well, now it's just me. we will go forward. So yes, welcome to the Joko, and as Tasha often does, we always begin with honoring both, our own ancestors as individuals of African descent, descendants of those who've been displaced in Turtle Island for some slave business and some primitive accumulation of capital over here in the Western Hemisphere. And we know that we do this on the unceded lands of the First Nations of Turtle Island, and where we specifically are, what is called the Los Angeles Basin, and we do this in the ancestral lands, the unceded lands of the Tongva people, of the what's now called the Los Angeles Basin, the coastal Tongva, the Chumash, coastal, a little further up the coast when you start getting into Ventura and Santa Barbara County. We are picking up where we left off as we are looking at particularly this moment of political reaction, the reactionaries that are in power, and really the climb to power that has seen nearly 40 years, 50 years of attacks on public education, on education, the arts, those intellectual areas of U.S. society. And very specifically and very aggressively, the way in which the current Trump regime is going after schools, colleges, universities, and particularly the sciences, right, through the withholding of funds or the the threat to withhold funds and defunding of research, really research across the board. But we've been looking at the attack on what people ordinarily think of as science and the sciences. And the way in which this is also, not just a function of a particular government right now, but of a cultural and a rhetorical atmosphere that has for decades questioned the validity of particular kinds of science, um, the the efforts of corporations to create doubt around scientific research that threatens their bottom line, that requires a more responsible practice from them, that takes climate science, for example, seriously. We see this played out in the anti-vax movement, as people are encouraged to doubt the science. Not They do not necessarily offer a robust alternative, but nonetheless feel empowered to question the scientific expertise of those who work in the field. And we are fortunate tonight to have somebody who works in the field to address some of these questions in this moment in our society. So I'm going to bring on our brother Glenn Simmons, that is Dr. Glenn Simmons, PhD, to join us. And I'll start by reading your bio, Brother Glenn. Professor Glenn E. Simmons Jr., PhD, is an assistant professor of cancer biology in the Department of Biomedical Sciences at Cornell University. His work as a molecular biologist focuses on understanding the connection between lipid metabolism and cancer using 3D bioprinting. Before joining Cornell in 2022 or
2021?
2021, during the COVID-19 pandemic, he focused his investigative efforts to test wastewater samples from wastewater plants in several communities throughout Minnesota to assist in identifying and tracking asymptomatic outbreaks. Welcome, Dr. Glenn Simmons, to the Joko.
Thank you for having me, Brother Yusuf.
Before we get into the questions, do you have any opening comments you'd like to make?
I was backstage and I was listening to your dialogue, and you know, it's it's a complex set of things that are happening right now. And just for me, I'm a bit of a student of history. History is like my second. Like if I could have got paid doing history, I
Mm-hmm.
probably would have did that.
Mm-hmm.
And to watch what's happening while knowing the history,
Yeah.
it's hard to imagine how anybody can make any of this make sense, to say that any of the arguments are in good faith, right? Because I think scientific inquiry, um, we have a bad rap. We have a bad rap, because there's a certain air that comes with it. And again, knowing the history, I get that, I understand it. But I think the thing that makes science kind of the neutral party that it can be is the ability to dialogue and
Mm-hmm.
debate and say, show me yours, I'll show you mine, and we'll come to some consensus of how close we are getting to whatever the current reality is. And I think what we're experiencing right now is an open willingness to basically say we don't want to dialogue anymore, which I think in the spirit of the Joko, right? It's like dialogue. This is community. We are meant to dialogue in order to have healthy community. And as soon as you're not willing to do that, you have something very different. And so I'll start with that before we get into it.
Great. That's actually a really great segue into, the first question up, and really that's just, what is science, right? What makes it meaningful? What is it about the scientific approach to knowing?
Right. So science, um, at the end of the day, is the process of observing and making logical either predictions or kind of an assessment of how things are. And so for myself, I'm in the life sciences that's just adjacent to what's called the natural sciences, but we look at the world and we try to understand the natural phenomena, or the biological phenomena. And when you are doing things in kind of the biomedical space, you do the same thing, but you try to leverage it in order to make health better, to improve
Mhm,
things. So we
mhm,
work, in a systematic fashion, asking questions. And then when we think we have an answer, we're willing to test that answer against the reality. And the science or the research that a lot of people think about is kind of that process done in a variety of ways. So you have what's known as the clinical trial, which is kind of the highest level of experimentation, in my opinion. And then you also have what's considered a reductionist approach, where you take only the bare minimum of things, and you might take a complex system and you say, but I'm only going to ask about A and B, and I'm not
mhm.
going to pay attention to the rest of that. And again, science is the systematic approach of taking the complex and figuring out how it works. And you do that with a very simple system. And then you make that system a little bit more complicated. And sometimes you get to the point where you actually might know something, but oftentimes you only know about the thing that you did, but it
Right.
doesn't always apply to the bigger system. And again, as a scientist, I I have to humbly, accept that there's a limit to how much I can know. But the process of attempting to get closer to that penultimate, truth about the reality around us is one of the goals, I think, of science, at least experimental science.
Okay. Tasha, you have a follow up to that?
Um, the follow-up, just brother, actually, this is something that we've talked about quite a lot as we've been dealing with the topic. You use the word humbly, right? And it speaks to a whole ethic, a whole ethic of the approach to knowledge, to accumulating information. And it is very interesting because we've done a lot of conversation about popular misunderstanding about science and the scientific approach. And it's so interesting that, as to the extent that it's a part of public myth, right, there is this kind of uh, what is it? An arrogance of knowing, an arrogance of certainty, of surety, of, you know what I'm saying, of bringing of a truth that the
Mhm.
scientific mind actually practice actually isn't about. If it's in its, like, if it's in its ethical, right, tradition, or in its
Absolutely.
ethical
Absolutely.
practice. And it's
Absolutely.
so that's very interesting because so many of the things that, one of the main counters, like we talked about when we were inviting you in about this attack on science in the context of the culture wars, right? And we're
Mhm.
Right.
often juxtaposed with religiosity and religious thinking
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
religious approaches to
Mhm.
knowing,
Mhm.
which do, absolutely claim truth, right?
Yeah.
Without
Yeah.
process. It is truth
Right.
as
Right.
is. And so
Right.
it's so, what you just said and everything you described is already um like really, really significant and really, really important in the vein of what it is that the scientific approach brings to the modern moment, right?
Mhm.
What does it mean to be scientific in approach? And like my last statement there is really just um the observation that there is this gap, right? This disconnect, this gap between what the process and practice of accumulating scientific information really is,
Mhm.
juxtaposed against that popular
Yeah,
notion
yeah,
what
yeah,
it
yeah.
is.
And one of the things that you learn, if you're lucky enough to learn through the process of becoming a scientist, like that's your day job, is that we spend a lot of time debating. And I'm using that term very loosely. I could use another term, arguing. We basically put thoughts in front of each other and we attack each other intellectually. And there are definitely situations in which that can be negative. It can be toxic. It can have all the things, but that's to be human, largely. Like human
Mm,
history has a lot of that. It doesn't matter what field of endeavor, you're going to have that. You could be painting paintings and you're going to have a lot of those same behaviors. But
mhm,
but the thing about it is that within science, though, for all the parts that are not quite working as good as they could, the thing that is inherently beneficial in it is that often that the scrutiny that is built into it helps to produce better outcomes, better products. Because if someone only did something in their own bubble, two
mm,
things would happen. They would either find out something and nobody would know about it because they were in their bubble, or they would not find out anything and no one would know that they didn't find it out because they were in their own bubble. So you have two things that happen when no one has dialogue. But you know what happens when, and again, we can go down a litany of African proverbs that
mhm,
talk
mhm.
about when you're working together,
Yeah, absolutely.
everything improves. Your
Yeah,
speed towards your objective
yeah,
improves. The quality of what you're putting together improves. And generationally, and see,
yeah.
that's the thing. When you get into this thing, you actually look at science and like, well, how did you come to that question? Well, these 30 studies, they were doing this and nobody answered that question, but they did all these things around it. And so I show up, I see that, and I inherit that will that I take the mantle and say, now I'm going to address this thing that nobody's been able to answer, but they got close. And if I can solve it or if I can improve upon it, I I'm adding to that. And so there's a lineage that's built into it that again, as much as we talk about science being kind of this technological thing or this thing that's isolated in these ivory towers, it takes a lot of the very same cues of every other aspect of human civilization where we take cumulative knowledge and transmit it forward into the future in the
Yes,
hopes that somebody's going to do better with it,
yes,
right? And
yes,
so I can't help but say I'm going to try to do my best to do the positive stuff with science. And that's how, we've been able to connect over the years where
yes.
I happen to know something. But the other thing about science, and I'm going to stop with my monologue in a second, but the other thing about
All right.
science is that you understand once you get your little degree, whichever kind of letters you get behind your name, you might be an expert in this one thing,
Yes.
this.
Mhm.
But because you've been reading a lot, because you've been hanging around a lot of other really intelligent people, you realize like there's a whole bunch of stuff I don't know anything about,
Right.
Yes.
right? And you work really hard to learn all the big words. Now that you know them, you know how many other big words you don't know.
Yes.
Right.
And I'm going to insert something
Exactly.
quickly so Yusuf can dive in. I'm going to insert something quickly, one of which is going to be an African proverb that speaks directly to this, very ancient proverb that speaks to that attitude of humility in knowing and as it essential to the process of accumulating knowledge, and also to point out, like you spoke about, the deliberative nature of scientific inquiry. You talked about the collaborative nature. All of those kinds of processes are um, very well are antithetical to this make it now, do it now, want a product, all these kinds of
Mhm,
things. They're
mhm,
very pro-social and they speak to a democratizing element. And right, in terms of, if we all have to sit together in exchange to arrive at an answer, it cannot
mhm,
be a top down kind of process. And that proverb, which we've been going back to an time and again, since we've been doing that, is from the instructions of Ptah-hotep, and I think you'll recognize as soon as I start it. Be not arrogant because of your knowledge, because of your great learning. The limits of knowledge have never been set, and no one has ever reached them. So take counsel with the ignorant as well as with the wise, for knowledge is as rare as emeralds, and yet it can be found among the women who gather at the grindstones. And it's such a beautiful, comprehensive expression. Ancient. I think it's, well, might be, I don't remember what kingdom, so I'm not going to get me lying because I don't remember, but it's instruction of Ptah-hotep. It's an Egyptian nobleman
Yeah,
talking.
very ancient though,
Yeah.
right? Maybe even perhaps even old kingdom ancient.
That's why I don't remember if it's Middle Kingdom or Old Kingdom. So I don't want to be all, oh, it's this and be all wrong, So I don't know.
But it ain't New Kingdom though. That's
It's show a new kingdom,
right,
and if it was, it would be plenty old.
Right.
Okay. And
Right, exactly.
Continuum. Speaking to what humans have understood about this, right? So, and it does speak to a whole life way, right? That is very antithetical to this moment of trying to contain, cramp, close down, and close off intellectual, right? Inquiry and the nature of it.
Yeah, right.
Well,
I mean, the little bit that we have,
right.
the little bit that we have, right.
Well, yeah, that's the closing off, right? When your comment about the religiosity of that we're confronting, which does close off, knowing, right? This is all you need to know, and this is the truth of the world. And the way you described it, Glenn, is the open-endedness of science, right? Knowing that this isn't the answer, and there's more. There's the next step, right? There's what I don't know, right? That a new generation or the generation after that will find that people, that is not effectively communicated in the general the general explanation of science, right? So when people say, well, it's only a theory, you don't know, blah, blah, this, well, we just because we don't know now doesn't mean we won't know at some other time, or that we won't keep trying to find out.
Absolutely. Yeah, like, I mean, as you speak on that, I remember, there's just so many pockets of history in different cultures around the world, different locations around the world. And I always tell people when they kind of, have that, well, you don't know, or that's just a theory, this is a theory and that's a theory. But I tell people the things that we do today was once magic. It wasn't even it was literally magic. And you couldn't do it. Now we do it without even thinking about it. And at some point, we're going to be saying the same thing about something else. And that's just what it is. And, as I've started to get my own bit of gray, over the last several years, the things that I'm seeing young people do now that I would have never dreamed about doing at the same stage in my development, you basically, again, you humble yourself to thinking like, I know how things are and the limits of things. And you become a bit more open-minded. It doesn't mean you have to accept everything, but you at least say, I don't really know. This is what I'm comfortable with, and this is where I'm gonna stay in this lane. But I know that things are probably gonna change, and it's gonna change when I'm gone. And it's probably changing while I'm here. But at the very least, I've adopted personally a system that allows for me to, partake in this inquiry of the universe, in a line of, my ancestors as well. Because again, I feel like this isn't something that's foreign, but there is a certain privilege to get to the point, for me to get to this point, to now look back and say, wow, this is really something that everybody should have access to. And I've been trying my best to find ways to give back and bring folks in. But it has its problems still, right? It still has its problems, but it's it's a fun place to be once you can get to it. That's how I see it. But I'm nerding out at this point.
That's all right.
and so it's so funny that you should say so, because we've been talking about that too, in terms of, in this fundamentally anti-intellectual culture, the kinds of places, or the kinds of characters that folks who are living, are organized around intellectual pursuits, are cast in: the nerd, the this, the that, the, I think Yusuf mentioned the absent-minded professor, the this, the that, you know what I'm saying? Someone who is a navel gazer, who is, all these
Right.
kinds of things. And really, there is a um there is observation, right, that human culture is organized around that, in terms of, like, well, we can take Joko, that's
Mhm.
what a Joko is. A Joko,
Hmm.
you see this reproduced. I don't really mean reproduced. You see it um happening, okay, in all kinds of cultures, the point at which,
Mhm.
and I'm thinking about some traditional cultures, some close to the earth cultures, some
Hmm.
cultures that folk would, that get the
Hmm.
label primitive, not just meaning first, you know what I'm saying?
Hmm.
That whole process of the
Yeah.
people of the village coming together and everybody sitting down, and they could reason over something for days as the community, you know what I'm
Hmm.
saying? How long, in order to come to a conclusion, a choice, a decision, this or that, and to be able to re-engage in that culturally is really, really important, is really, really important, and takes us to the, I think, to a very pro-human place. You can't be, you know what I'm saying, all wrapped up in your no and your absolutism, and be connected with others at the same time. And this is
Yeah.
something that,
Yeah.
right, this fascist piece totally takes humans away from, you know, that connection, that culture of connection and exchange,
Mm.
etc.
Mm.
Right. So I'm looking at the time, and I'm sitting here thinking about, which question maybe to skip or other.
Yeah,
But yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and do that, because reading your bio, and you're looking specific, at cancer biology. So we'll
Right.
go to that question, right? Fighting cancer.
Okay.
And one of the, and then, as the question's been constructed, right? Fight the, quote unquote, fighting cancer as
Hmm.
a primary theme of contemporary Western cultural narrative, right?
Right.
And part of that narrative of progress, and Western medicine, as a often, used as a symbol of Western superiority, even, really, and Western progress. But
Hmm.
besides all that, right, and the real work, right,
Hmm.
good that has come from cancer research, what have been some major breakthroughs, and what's happening or likely to happen with cancer research, under the policies and this onslaught of the current Trump regime.
Um, so I mean, I'll start with probably the biggest major breakthrough I would in the last couple of decades, would be immunotherapy.
Hmm.
The ability to re-engage our immune system, our body's natural defense to attack these cancer cells. And so for people who aren't familiar with this concept, so our bodies are normally checking and getting rid of things that are bad, both things from the outside like viruses, bacteria, but also when cells are dying or cells might think they want to become a cancer cell. When their immune systems are really healthy, they take care of that. And our body is constantly doing something that's a little off topic, and the immune
Hmm.
system checks it, right? Now, when an actual cancer starts to grow, it starts to really take a foothold. What happens is that the immune cells near that come towards that cancer to attack it, they can get turned off. Basically, hit the brakes, don't do anything here. And so with immunotherapy, at least the immunotherapy that most people are familiar with, which is called checkpoint blockade immunotherapy, um, it has the ability to re-engage those immune cells that are right there. So analogously, imagine if you needed to call security, call the police or something like that, and they show up, but they don't come in. Now you
Mhm.
inside, you have a problem. You need them to come in, but they're not going to come in for whatever reason. The immune therapy, the checkpoint blockade therapy, has the ability to open the door and usher them in. And this has been a game changer for diseases, particularly like melanoma, which
Mm,
had not really had a really high success rate in terms of treatment.
Mhm.
This has been one of the most successful therapies for melanoma, immune checkpoint therapy. Now, that's one positive thing. I'm not going to go into the other side of that, which is what's wrong with it. But then you also have the omics explosion. Like we're doing high level science at a single cell level.
Mhm.
So at one point, the big thing was the ability to even genetically sequence tissue, to sequence a cell, to identify the genes and the mutations that are present. And it costs so much for us to do that. So if you're familiar, at one point, being able to sequence the entire human genome was a major undertaking. We've
Mhm.
done that. We've completed it. We still don't have all the information. But within cancer research, the technology to sequence a tumor was pretty costly at one point. Now, in many places, many bigger research facilities have the ability to do that for every patient that comes in. And that's now common. But the thing that's kind of changed the game is the ability to do what we call like multi-omic studies. So you can look at the transcripts or the genes. So that's transcriptomics. You can look at the proteins. That's proteomics. And then you can do this at the single cell level. So you have the ability to single cell sequence. So each individual cell, you can identify the genes that are expressed in that cell, and then you take that technology. I'm not even done yet. So you take that technology and then you apply it in space. So I
Mhm.
can take a tissue and now I can map where that cell is within the tissue and I can sequence it. So that's called
Mhm.
single cell RNA sequencing. And we're to the point now where almost every major university in the country, at least the ones that have obvious cancer centers, have the ability to do this. But even to the point where you don't have to be there to do it. You can just send your samples there. They'll do the work, send you back the data. And that's going to unlock a whole lot of information that we did not know about what's happening in these cancers. So those are things that I would say are really, kind of transformative on the one, just the general treatment paradigm, but then also on the technology side, because as we get better at doing it, the cost goes down. You start implementing it in more places, more people have access to it, particularly patients have access to it, but the researchers have access to it. And then we can ask more sophisticated questions that we couldn't ask before. The last thing I'll bring up in terms of kind of the breakthrough, like just game changing types of things on the treatment side, are these modified immune cells. These, I don't know if you've heard of it, but they're called CAR T cells. Um, so this is stands for C chimeric, A antigen, R receptor T cell. So they have a chimeric antigen receptor. So chimera comes from a Greek Latin term. It's kind of like the idea if you take an animal and you mix all the parts together.
Mhm.
It sounds kind of Frankensteinish, I will admit. But the idea is that when we have these immune cells that are not able to target cancer, so immune therapy doesn't work for everybody. That's that negative side I didn't want to bring up. So with a CAR T cell or even CAR other immune cells, so you can do other immune cells with these CAR modifications, you take a receptor that is specifically designed to target the cancer cell. And on one end, it can home itself. It can find a way like a homing missile to the cancer. But on the other side, it sends a signal to that immune cell that tells it, hey, when you hit that target, go to work. When you find this thing, do what you got to do. So
Yeah.
again, it's kind of like opening up the door and sending it in. What the way this works though is that you can actually take these cells out of a person, engineer them, put them back in, and then they avoid getting removed from some type of like graft versus host type of negative
Mhm.
rejection response, but
Mhm.
they're primed to kill the cancer cell. So it's the kind of stuff that not too long ago people would say, you crazy, you're going to take all this stuff out of this person, put it back in, and it's going to get rid of any bad stuff that's inside of them. Now it's kind of like, yeah, duh, now how can we make it better?
Right.
So those are some of the big things that are happening right now that, to me, I'm probably not even telling you the newest new stuff, but I know that
Mhm.
those things are well established enough that anybody could go on the internet, go on PubMed, which is a repository for all the most recent peer-reviewed studies. You see the stuff, we've been doing it for years. Now, the other side, what's happening now in the context of the federal government's kind of shift in priorities, so to speak. Um, it's bad. It's bad. I don't. I wish I had an eloquent way of saying that. It's what's going on right now as far as how it's going to impact cancer. There's almost no way for us to know just how bad it can get.
Mhm.
I can't imagine it being good. The
Mhm.
worst case scenario, it won't be that bad. That's the best case scenario. I'm sorry.
That's
The best case scenario is that it won't be that bad. One
right.
of the things that we already are experiencing, and this is something that I want to say for the audience, and if this is recorded, that folks can look at this later. You you have to understand the structure of how biomedical research works. Biomedical research, like it's almost like you could be the best basketball player, but if you don't have good trainers, if you don't have decent coaches, if you don't have decent shoes, if you don't have a good gym, especially if you're somewhere in the wintertime and you're like your gym better be hot, you don't have a good workout program, diet program. Like there's so many other things besides just being in the game.
Mhm.
So if I were the star player, I mean, I'm kind of good at science, but I'm not going to say that I'm the best of all time. But in order for me to do what I do, I need a whole slew of people in the federal government that are prepared to handle making sure that the money is available, making sure that they can review the grant, making sure that the grant is going to be administered properly, and
Mhm.
then making sure that the funds get to my institution. And then there's a whole bunch of people at my institution that have to manage all of those processes. Now,
Mhm.
what's been told to us has been that they're trying to reduce waste. And on the outside looking in, it's like, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. But again, the enterprise, the thing that we do when it comes to science requires a lot of overhead. And
Mhm.
we're not even talking about the experiments yet. We're
Right.
just talking about making sure that the people who are best suited to do the work are able to do it and don't have to be part-time accountants, part-time administrators, part-time grant
Mhm.
managers, and have to manage a team of anywhere from 3 to 20 people to actually execute the studies. I have a small lab. My lab has 10 people in it. My lab is small,
Okay.
right? And
Okay.
what we know is going to happen is that as they're making just the cuts, we're not even going to talk about how they're targeting specific initiatives that have certain nouns in them,
Mhm.
certain
Mhm.
adjectives in them, and they're just eliminating programs. We're not going to talk about that. We know that that's bad on a lot for a lot of reasons. As a matter of fact, just to touch on that, we know that that's being done again not in good faith, because in order for someone to evaluate science, like for myself, I have to be qualified to review other people's work and say this work has value, you should fund it, this work has a bunch of holes, they need to try again. I have to be
Mhm.
qualified.
Mhm.
That means I have to read the grant too. I have to be qualified enough to read it and understand it. It is not an easy process. They don't
Right.
pay us enough to do it. Let me be honest, it's a full-time job to try to do this. They have cut certain programs, and this is in the news. They cut certain programs that had words that triggered something. I'm not going to say that they were using AI, but whoever saw the word mistook the word that they were concerned about for something
Mhm.
that was related to what we consider transgenic models.
Mhm.
Now, a transgenic model. So remember, I was talking about those chimeric antigen receptors a minute ago. So sometimes we do things in other species, right? And in order to make that species a good research model, we may need to add some human genes because we want to make it relevant to a human disease. So we make a transgenic mouse. Now, I'm not going to say which word because I don't want this to be on YouTube and there to be an issue,
Right.
but you can imagine that something flagged that research that is part of the clinical pipeline
Process.
to take
Right.
basic science to the hospital, to the bedside, and that whole program was immediately flagged. Now, I don't know if they reversed it, but that's just how things have been going. Now, what's been happening is that they've been removing a lot of the program officers, the program directors within the federal government, within certain other national agencies. So NIH, NSF, USDA, like people are like just gone. Some people I know personally. And what that means is that the connection that we have. So in order for somebody to get funding, oftentimes you basically get what we call a program officer. In a way, this person is kind of your first entree into whether the federal government is interested in your work. And so you have a conversation. They manage a portfolio of grants and they kind of know where things are going, what's kind of hot, and they help guide both senior and junior scientists who are out here in the rest of the world, because unless you work in NIH as a scientist, we're what you call extramural. We're outside of the federal government, but the federal government funds most of the research that happens in this country. So,
Mm.
or at least the biomedical stuff, I should say.
Mhm.
And so by those people disappearing, that means that the people who are funded within those different programs have no connection anymore. There's nobody there, right? And that's just one node. Imagine all the other people. There's nobody managing the influx of grant applications. So we've actually had pauses on certain grant announcements, like, oh, I thought I was going to submit a breast cancer project this year, and it's going to be for this specific announcement that had these specific criteria that I think my work is perfect for. You get an email. No, you're not going to do that. We're pausing that. Or that study section, which is the group of people who evaluate the grants, they're not even going to meet. And I've had several colleagues on Twitter call me up like, man, my study section isn't going to meet. So they're not going to review my grant. I spent 6 months writing that grant. I probably spent the better part of a year or two just getting the data, then spending 6 months writing the grant, getting
Mhm.
evaluated. That whole process of basically cutting my teeth, because I have to hand that to somebody. They tell me like, nah, you this part right here ain't no good, or this ain't no good. Then I give it to a bunch of strangers that are gonna do that times 20. Now you're telling me like, oh, I can't do that because they're not gonna meet, because y'all don't want them to meet, because nobody's there to organize that whole meeting. Again, these things
Mhm.
don't happen on their own. And when you're
Mhm.
not a part of that process, you would think that, oh, the scientists just sit around and they decide who's going to do science. No, we sit around and then we scrutinize the mess out of it, but then they go somewhere else and then so there are layers of it so that we can try our best to be good stewards with this money that's coming from the American public.
Right.
Like I don't own the science, right? The
Mhm.
science goes out. That's why anytime somebody asks me, I'm not paid by a company. So you want to know what I'm up to? I'll tell you. Because I didn't pay for it.
Mhm.
I paid in
Mhm.
sweat equity. That's about it. But the cash that went into it is circulating through the American, system.
Mhm.
And what we see now is basically the confidence of a lot of young faculty. I guess I'm still technically young faculty. I'm pre-tenure. But those even younger than me, the trainees, the postdocs, the graduate students, everybody's looking and they're like, what is this? But for those of us who've already been on the, postgraduate side long enough, we're like, well, I know exactly what it is. We're going to have to figure out how to do a lot of things ourselves. And we're going to
Mhm.
have to try to our best to maybe even support those who are still in place. But we've lost a lot of people. We lost a
Mm.
lot of people already. And countless people who may have been coming into the field who are now like, I don't know about that.
Mhm.
Interestingly, though, and I may even like be segueing into another
Mhm.
point, is that academia, even with all the stuff that's happening, still might be the safest place to do science at the
Mhm.
moment. At the
Mhm.
moment, I mean, it's not as volatile as people might think, just because there are other ways to make it happen
Mm.
within an academic context. But a lot of things are going to likely change because
Mhm.
not only are we losing staff, both at the federal level and at the institutional level that can help support the science getting done. If you tell me that I'm going to lose 20% of a portion of my grant, that's not necessarily going to just make it hard for me to do the experiments. That's going to make it hard for me to support people who are going to do the work, because most of the times faculty, our salary might already be locked in. Like it has to
Mhm.
get paid from that grant. Then the amount of money that it costs to do the work, that's a set number. But
Mhm.
oh, I have to pay for my student.
Mhm.
I have to pay for my technician. And as we think about democratizing and making sure that the workforce reflects this country accurately, and I've
Mhm.
told y'all since since way back when, I'm always trying to pull as many folks in as I can who feel like this isn't the space they're supposed to be in. I don't
Mhm.
care if I'm where I'm at now or if I was where I was at before. I'm always going to have the same intent, and it's going to be really hard to do that for folks who want to operate the way I'm trying to operate, and even folks who might think they want to operate that way. Because if you limit the coffer, if you make that pool of money smaller, it's no longer about what I want, it's about what I can physically do.
Mhm.
You know, like if I gotta keep the lights on, or I'm gonna bring another student in here that I'm gonna be paying for the next 5 6 years.
Right.
The
Mhm.
lights are more important.
Mhm.
And that sounds really messed up, but it
Mhm.
means that you stop recruiting. And if you
Right.
do recruit, you recruit sure wins. You don't recruit nobody that you think you got to work with.
Mhm.
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 And so what I feel like, and this is might circle back a little bit, but if you think about it, um, if the intent is to change the composition of
Mhm.
certain areas of our society, if that's part of the intent, when it comes to science, technology, engineering, and mathematics,
Mhm.
I'm not I'm not confident that they're going to get what they want and it work out the way that they intend,
Mhm.
because we know that with the DOE situation, with the way that they're treating people who are here legally
Mhm.
Mhm.
through immigration practices,
Mhm.
you can kind of see what they're doing, but it's like, wait, you're tearing down a lot of things, isolating a lot of people, so you only seemingly want certain people to win.
Right.
And it's not the majority of the country, regardless of what you
Right.
look like. It's not the majority,
Mhm.
because the DOE situation is obviously going to impact red states. I lived in a few red
It
states in
Absolutely.
my
sure
day,
will.
and
Mhm.
those are the places that need the most help from the Department of
Right.
Education.
Mhm.
Right.
That's right.
So,
Mhm.
but
Mhm.
yeah,
Mhm.
I say that I say that to say that I can't see cancer research progressing as much as it has over the last, I would say, 10 20 years, if the infrastructure continually erodes at the rate that is eroding in the last
Mhm.
6 months.
Mhm. Well,
Hmm.
considering
Mhm.
everything you just shared, you know, other governments are inviting, U.S. researchers to come to their universities, and I know, some folks are making those choices already.
Mhm.
Getting an echo for some reason, but the question is, you see this brain drain increasing, and how bad do you think the brain drain might end up being?
So, when I was thinking about the brain drain, I was thinking more on with an internal brain drain,
Hmm.
but to think about it from a kind of an international lens, um, I don't see it happening just yet. I don't see
Hmm.
it happening just yet. And that's not to say I don't think that it will happen to some extent. I think it's going to be one of those things where, you'll have like the canary in the coal mine type of situations. Like you'll get signs, and then
Hmm.
boom, you'll notice it. It'll be too late by the time you notice it, because a lot of our scientific workforce is not domestic. A lot
Mhm.
of it is. It's not
Mhm.
the majority, but a lot of it
Mhm.
is. And
Mhm.
so my concerns are that we're going to initially see a slight lack of influx, but it won't be anything major, because the 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 reality is that our system is so robust compared to a lot of places that even
Hmm.
if we lost a significant percentage of how we normally operate, it's still better than some of our, I guess, comparable
Mhm.
national competitors or
Mhm.
international competitors. It's still as good, if not better. Like from an infrastructure standpoint, from the number of ways that people can get money. I was talking with a friend of mine in Canada, and I remember being like, "Hey, like, what's the situation like there?" And they were like, "You might not want to make that move just yet. Not because it's bad, but because, again, the amount of money that
Mhm.
flows in the US on a research standpoint is ridiculous. And the other side of it is that when it comes to, like, for some people, they just want to get into the academy, for instance.
Mhm.
We have a lot of really good institutions across the board.
Yeah.
And people don't understand when, I was talking with somebody and they were like, man, you live in the US and you don't never go anywhere. It's like, have you ever been to the US? Like, have you really been here? Like, if I go to another state, that's another country,
Mhm.
right? So,
Yeah.
like, how people move within the EU, it's like, yes, that's the United States, but it's even bigger. So, but thinking about it from an opportunity standpoint, there's a lot of resources like at the state level to get work done. So
Mhm.
I happen to be in New York. New York has a lot of resources that are available. Where I was previously in Minnesota has resources. We got private foundations out the wazoo. So it's gonna be a while before I think we would see a true brain drain, but I
Mhm.
will not be surprised if we don't see it within the next 2 to 3 years when we start seeing the graduate programs completely change. Because once the
Mhm.
graduate programs change, because a lot of times we recruit internationally,
Right.
right? And so you start looking like, well, if we bring in these international students, they are not eligible for domestic funds. So
Mhm.
those grants that are tied to the U.S. government, they oftentimes can't get those. That puts the financial burden on the people who they're working for. You
Mhm.
know, if that money is a smaller pot, you're not as willing. But if you know you have a sure bet, you might do it. But what does that mean if the pot of money is smaller, or if there is no federal money? I'm going to pay for the sure bet
Yeah.
who has
Yeah.
years in biotech somewhere else, and they just want to come over here and get some letters.
Mhm.
I like this person because they're ready to go. I don't want to
Right.
train somebody up. I want somebody who's just
Mhm.
going to do what I tell them to do.
Mhm.
And again, it comes down to a business
Mhm.
decision, and it's no
Mhm.
longer about the social
Yes.
societal need to change
Mhm.
how things are going. It's
Mhm.
like, I need to get this work done. I have two pennies that I'm rubbing together right now.
Mhm.
Mhm.
And so I think the brain drain will be a slow. It'll be like freezing, a bottle of water. Like, it'll look like it's still water, and then you tap something and it freezes instantly. It's like that's super
Mhm.
cold. I think that's what we're going to experience. But
Mhm.
I don't know that much, but I feel like that's what's going to happen.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Mhm. It surely makes a lot of sense in this move toward like conditions forcing folk to become more transactional than,
Mhm.
expansive, and just the whole, yeah, suppression of, those lighter airs of the spirit, inspiration and innovation, and let's try this and let's do that, and all of that things that resourcing a thing leads to, that
Mhm.
whole
Mhm.
death by defunding
Right.
approach is just that, death by defunding. I'm often, or the phrase that keeps coming back to my mind in the uh, in the midst of all of this is dark ages. Dark
Hmm.
ages.
Yeah,
You
Mhm.
no,
know,
we've been there. We've been there.
setting
And
up.
but you know what led to the dark ages, though? Like, we had a
Yes.
period where things were looking real good,
Uh
but
huh.
who was driving it, right? And
Uh
then,
huh.
then you have the dark ages. Then you have so it's a
Yeah.
cyclical thing where there's a rejection of whatever progress,
Yeah.
and unfortunately, oftentimes that progress is being led by
Yes.
certain folks, and
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
that just can't happen.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody does not like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I won't say it on the internet, but I
Yeah.
will. You know, those
Yeah.
who know understand. Like read a history book, you'll see it happening over and over. At a global scale, this is how it's always happened.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right. Well, it is almost 7 o'clock,
Indeed.
and we know you're on Eastern time too. So we don't want to keep you really longer, right? Than that. So, any closing comments you want to make?
Well, I mean, my biggest thing right now, and I think it was the same thing back when we were in the throes of dealing with COVID, is
Mm-hmm.
that we have to keep a dialogue going at a
Right.
community level, and wherever people are. And I say that from an expertise standpoint, the things that people know within the community, that should become a community resource.
Mm-hmm.
And what that would afford us is the ability to have dialogue. For
Right.
in Islam, it's called ashura, where you have this, you're consulting, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I'm gonna sit down. This is what I'm thinking. I'm bringing it to everybody else. And
Mm-hmm.
when you bring it to everybody else, one, you're showing a certain level of humility. But
Mm-hmm.
the other thing is that you get the collective experience and wisdom from the group. And
Yeah.
now that solution is the most holistic solution you could possibly get.
Mm-hmm.
And when I'm thinking about science as a whole, we're in a space where a big issue is that we have left people out. We've left people behind. And that's partly because science was an elitist thing,
Mm-hmm.
you know. And to an extent it always has been, because we know
Right.
in ancient times, that was a class. Like
Right.
I never thought about it, but it's like, oh my goodness, I'm a part of that class now.
Right.
Like I would have been a priest somewhere, you know what I'm saying? But we have to reintegrate ourselves better in order for things to change,
Mm-hmm.
and risk to some extent coming down from on high.
Mm-hmm.
Risk,
Mm-hmm.
being scrutinized just in a different
Mm-hmm.
kind of way. Because again, we get scrutinized, and when you come in, and I mean, like looking like this,
Mm-hmm.
was not going to pass at one point. So,
Right.
like, as I'm trying to take as much liberty to occupy as much space as I can, I have to then remember that, hey, like, the privilege comes with some responsibility. And so I'm always trying to get out. I'm always trying to engage, but it gets harder. It gets harder and harder because the job gets harder and harder.
Yeah.
And I think we need grace on both sides, to move forward, because I always tell people I'm always available. And I mean, the Joko is definitely good about keeping up with me, because I'm like, I'm here, but I ain't got time to reach out to nobody. Not because
Right.
I don't want to, but because I
Right.
am that absent-minded professor.
Yeah.
Like I'm the only thing I'm not absent with is my kids, right?
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm absent about everything else. Like if I'm doing an experiment, I'm focused on that, and I got my phone on my hip in case something's going on with the kids. Everything else is secondary, and
Mm-hmm.
that is an unfortunate reality for me. But I've
Mm-hmm.
always said I'm available. If you call
Mm-hmm.
me, I'm going to answer. I'm going to do something. I even, when it comes to students, and I'll say this now, if anybody is interested in having dialogue, understanding a little bit more about what it is to do science, even what
Yes.
it means to get into it as a profession, I'm
Yes.
always willing to sit down and talk with people. And I've been doing it since I got to Cornell, because there's nothing more important to me than to leverage these spaces that I'm now in, because
Right.
somebody sees I'm at Cornell and they're like, "Oh my goodness, you're at Cornell!" Because again, that's the halo effect. Like I could be
Right.
dumb as rocks, but Cornell is on my email address.
Right.
Right.
So that gives
Yeah.
me some credibility,
Yeah.
and I'm like, okay, I'm going to use it, but I want to use
Yeah.
it to help people understand
Yeah.
that I'm not doing anything significantly different, in my opinion. I just
Right.
happen to enjoy asking questions and arguing. That's it.
Mm-hmm.
That's
Mm-hmm.
it. And again, as I look at my ancestors, I realize, like, we've
Mm-hmm.
been doing this for a long time.
Yeah.
This isn't foreign.
Yes. Yes.
Now the system in some ways may be foreign, but once I start
Mhm.
looking at it at a certain angle, I'm like, if you've never been to the Cornell campus, it's probably one of the most beautiful college campuses in the country. It is gorgeous. But
Mm-hmm.
when I look at it, I see
Mhm.
remnants of the
Mhm.
temple of the Heliopolis. Like it's like, yo, this is a different kind of space. It has
Yeah.
a certain air about it. And I'm up in
Mhm.
here and I got the robes. You know what I'm saying? Like it's like you start
Mhm.
seeing it, and then
Mhm.
you have to remind yourself, like, I have to let people know they can come in here, because
Yeah.
I was ignorant of the fact that people felt
Right.
the force field. So
Mhm.
the
Right.
last thing I would want to say is that my job is to make science as understandable and approachable as possible,
Mhm.
and to make it work for people. And so
Yeah.
the
Mhm.
work that I do is what you would call translational. So I do stuff in the lab with every intent for it to make its way out into the world, and not just in
Mhm.
textbooks, but to make it functional.
Yeah.
And honestly, I would love to make what I do obsolete. But the thing that we know is that cancer, in some form or fashion, has always been with us. The
Mhm.
issue is that what we're dealing with now, with the incidents, with the just preponderances
Yeah.
of people dealing with it, that's not normal. But the actual disease itself,
Yeah.
it's always been around, and it's been documented.
Right.
So
Mhm.
I would love to make the stuff that I'm doing now on the scale that I'm doing it. Like, you know what? I can't do that no more. I'm gonna go deal with something else, because we're back to where we started, where it's like it's an
Mhm.
occasional thing. It's very rare, but we have a lot of things happening right now, and I know I'm ranting right now because I get
No
passionate about
worries.
this,
Yeah.
but we can't get there without each other. I can't do
Mhm.
what I need to do without
Yes.
y'all. I can't do what I need to do without the folks that they are basically giving pink slips to
Yeah.
in all these government agencies. I can't do it. Science is expensive, but it also is a extremely communal endeavor. It's not
Absolutely.
something that you do by yourself. Like, I can sit here and think all day, but I can't execute without help.
Yes.
I can't do most of the things I've done in
Yeah.
my laboratory without my students, without my technicians. It
Yeah.
doesn't
Right.
operate like that. And once you see it, you
Yes.
start seeing the myth of the lone hero completely
Yes.
disintegrate.
Yeah.
Yes.
And it was always a team. Like, every now and then you might have a genius. I'm not a genius. I got a team.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Michael Jordan, he's great. He still had to have some people playing
Right.
some roles.
Right.
I ain't Michael.
Yeah.
I might be BJ Armstrong level myself,
Yeah.
but I got some people around me
Right.
that make me look good, and
Yeah.
hopefully, we can continue to grow. I can continue to motivate other folks, and then answer any questions that they may have, because these types of exchanges where it's not formulaic, I'm
Yeah.
not getting anything out of it. I tell folks, like, I do this, and you know I'm doing it because this is what I set out to do. When I graduated from Meharry Medical College, I knew from being at Meharry, being in that beautiful brown space,
Yeah.
Mhm.
with all those bright folks, people,
Yeah.
like, I never would have thought that it would be such a concentration of brilliance in one place, and it
Mhm.
all felt familiar. Like, I would love to just replicate that everywhere I go,
Right.
you know,
Right.
and clearly, it had a positive impact on me, and I want that for other young people. And even if you don't look like me, I just want you to understand what it feels like to be in a space, to be utterly comfortable, and to be inspired to do something that you didn't think was possible.
Right.
Well, the way you speak about it, that is, and I know we had time, but the way you speak about it, Glenn, Dr. Simmons, because your brother Glenn, this is brother Glenn, who happens to practice science, but all of these things that you're talking about, only a brother Glenn, well, maybe not only brother Glenn, but I'm going to say only brother Glenn, right? This is this importance of diversity, of diversifying. And I'm not speaking from the lens or from the point of view of the racist system being challenged and trying to wrap itself around these words. I'm talking about what we can do internally in
Mhm.
our communities. You know what I'm saying? The ways that we can replicate and neutralize the myth of the prodigy, the myth of the lone hero of science.
Mhm.
We can
Mhm.
eliminate that sort of thing. The way that you, with your particular lens as a practitioner of the sciences and as a uh, 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 African descendant person, also well educated in that African descent, the lens that you have and what you can communicate is avant garde. It's taking us to a next level in considerations. What kind of questions would we ask? What kinds of, you're right, would we pursue? What would, this whole question about when we get in control of our resources and our this and our that. Yeah, there's a different world to be had, and it's not a
Mm,
marginal world, and it's not, we can actually be in the center of that world and dispel so many of these artificial, oppressive, hierarchical notions, So I say all that to say, yeah, we're taking you up on it every time we get a chance to help you communicate, you know, um, communicate out. We're going to tap that. We're going to tap into that because this is an incredibly important discussion to have. And like you said, even all communities, because it's not only the defeat and the elimination in terms of scientific racism, the notion that only Europeans have this part working, you know what I'm saying? That, right? We eliminate that when we are engaged with the Black scientist, right? But yeah, other peoples also need to understand that it's not only, or let's say we say other peoples, yeah, other peoples. Let's talk about the white underclass. Yeah, they need to understand that it's not only elites, that this part of the physiology is not only the realm of the elites, and that whole force field piece
mm,
needs to be eliminated, needs to be broken down, needs to be right. We need to socialize, we need to rehumanize everything that we do. And that is our better world. That is our better world. Anyway, I'm not going to rant. I will not rant.
Well, likewise, yeah, we will definitely have you back, right? Thank you, Brother Glenn. This was a
Yes.
fantastic conversation, and really served well to fill in some holes, even in the discussion we've been having on the anti-intellectualism and this present, current,
yeah.
pointed and intentional, attack on universities, the arts, the intellectuals of the society in general. So, thank you, brother. I'll go ahead and take you off stage, and have a good evening.
All right.
Yes.
Appreciate it. Thank y'all so
Thank you
much.
so much. All right.
Peace.
Yay. How wonderful.
Yes, that was a wonderful, conversation, and like you said, some grounding and some depth, for the conversations we've been having
Mm-hmm.
about this attack on science and on the universities,
Mm-hmm.
on the international character, right? As you maybe have been following, and we know that there's another Columbia student
Yes.
from South Korea who's ICE's after, right, for her solidarity with the people of Palestine.
Mm-hmm.
We know this brother at Cornell, right? That where Dr. Glenn Simmons
Mm-hmm.
is under attack, and then I guess just today, perhaps earlier today or yesterday,
Mm-hmm.
a student at Tufts University
Yes.
basically kidnapped on the street.
Yes.
Um,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Graduate student, I believe, in the sciences.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
and so as we're trying to figure out what that's going to look like as it does begin to trickle down to the various systems, right? The state systems, um, what the funding cuts are going to mean for one of the best things going, as Glenn said. That's one thing about the United States. uh,
Mm-hmm.
and it's and probably and mostly a function, I guess I would say, of the second half of the 20th century.
Mm-hmm.
The number of really fine colleges, right?
Mm-hmm.
The state
Mm-hmm.
college systems, the
Mm-hmm.
HBCUs, the state college systems, whether similar to California, you have the UCs and the Cal states, and I think other states have similar elite so-called public universities and the more general public university, and something really unique in the United States, the community college system.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, Probably the most democratic aspect, right, of U.S. public education, even more so than
Mhm.
the K through 12s.
Mhm.
Because anybody can come and
Mhm.
start over and just
Right.
apply. You ain't got to enroll and just apply
Right. Right.
and come learn at any point in life, and even if you are still in high school. But all of these things are going to be impacted
Mhm.
as those federal education and research dollars find their ways
Mhm.
down.
Mhm.
Um, as you know, I work at a community college, and
Mhm.
we we have opportunities for Fulbright grants, for example, and those Fulbright grants are federal, right?
Mhm.
So that community college instructors can go teach overseas, somewhere, and have a the professor exchange, right? That
Yeah.
the Fulbright. What's going to happen to those things, right? For the global citizenship program at my college. There's the Gilman scholarships set aside specifically for community college students to study abroad. It's a federal scholarship, right? The Gilman, there's a Gilman McCain scholarship, and the McCains aren't popular with the Republican or not, right? Not popular
Yes.
with the current regime. What happens to those scholarships? And I don't know. I'm asking those questions, right? Because they are
Yes.
federal, right? They are federal. Are they receiving any private funding, perhaps? But I think that's the whole idea, is to privatize everything ultimately.
Yes.
Um, and private research is
Mhm.
focused on profit, not the public good.
Right.
These private
Right.
research under these capitalist relations and
Yes.
intention.
Yes.
It's not charity.
Yes.
It's write-offs
Yes.
um,
Mhm.
and usually the kind of research the private institutions use um, is based on the basic research that happens at the universities. So that cancer research that Glenn was talking about, right? That kind of stuff that then a company will take and
Mhm.
figure out how to apply it, right? But that basic research has got to be done first.
Mhm. Mhm.
So
Mhm.
anyway,
Mhm.
it was a wonderful conversation.
It's a wonderful conversation, and, just that as he was talking and talking about his intentions and inspirations and, goals as a member of the community, that whole notion of the science communicator,
Yeah.
which people are like, right, getting like certifications in this, getting degrees in this, and you know what I mean, just in this I'd love to know more about that, how that
Mm-hmm.
came about as a field, because it
Mm-hmm.
absolutely
Mm-hmm.
sounds like it's something that was birthed to in recognition that there was
Mm-hmm.
a gap, you know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
A very
Mm-hmm.
significant and detrimental gap in public
Mm-hmm.
understanding, and these
There's
and
something
gaps
about it that
closed.
feels very organic, in the
Yeah,
way it emerged, right?
uh-huh. Oh, you're saying you said
This role of the science
yeah,
communicator feels
yeah.
like a very organic
Yeah,
role. That's
yeah, it does, it does, and there is, there's absolutely that need and that, um just that opportunity to
mm-hmm,
for folks, for everybody in the community to what is it? To knock out the elitism, the separation of elitism, right? Something my mother always used to say and talk about, right? In reflecting on her childhood, even growing up in rural Marshall, Texas, right?
mm-hmm,
But her reflection was that everybody, all the Black people lived in the same community. So if you were a
Right.
professional Black person, you know what I'm saying? I said all our doctors, our lawyers, our, you know what I'm saying? Everybody was right
I
there.
do. I'm just old enough to remember that in the Los Angeles neighborhood where I grew up, right, not far from where I live now, but just that, right? Almost
Yeah.
everything in our lives, you know, we went to Black owned places, right, in a primarily Black community, except for the
Mhm,
one Japanese owned market in the neighborhood, and
mhm,
whom with whom we really kind of shared the neighborhood a little bit there. So
mhm, mhm,
yeah, exactly.
mhm,
And so
mhm.
exactly, the doctor was Black, the office was in the neighborhood, the
Yes,
cleaner, the meat market, etc.
everybody, right, and that sense of what am I saying? That when the divergence happens and happened largely in terms of Black professionals opting to not live in Black
Mhm,
communities.
mhm. And not work
That's
in Black
everybody,
communities also,
huh?
not have their offices in
And
Black
not have
communities.
their offices in Black communities. Yes, right? Um, that creates a mystification.
Mhm,
Creates a mystification. Puts a
mhm,
veil over um,
mhm,
different, just the
mhm.
different things that people do, the different options that are available, the different kinds of, ways to be in a society. So, in a culture, in a village, um,
Mhm.
and so that in itself suppresses imagination, right? And so as everyone comments, we have generations of young people who can't imagine professions, who don't imagine professions largely outside of sports careers, meaning if they are thinking
Yeah,
expansively, and I'm
yeah.
not trying to qualify that with wealth notions or what have you. I'm not even trying to qualify it, but just thinking expansively. If you want to do something significant, you know what I'm saying? Then you're gonna be going in this direction, and entertainment, or I guess politics. There's that model, and certainly there are still some, but for the masses of us, in terms of what the masses are looking at.
Mhm.
Um,
Possibly a military career because it's stable, you know.
and it's presented to you, right?
Mhm,
That's something that is in our high schools, right?
mhm,
Absolutely.
definitely.
These kinds of things. And also something that's interesting in terms of, so many people, young people now say they want to do culinary careers. And my guess is that has
Mhm,
some relationship to the proliferation of cooking competition shows.
mhm. I'm
You know what
sure
I'm
that
saying?
does have something to do with it, right? And the emergence of the celebrity chef, right? Which has
Right,
been around since what, at least the Galloping Gourmet, right? And Julia
right.
Child, but it's on a different scale
On a
now,
different
right? And,
scale.
and I think
Yeah,
you're absolutely right, in term
yeah,
in those terms, right? And
yeah. You know. And I don't want to, feel conflicted with putting out the disclaimer of there's nothing wrong with those things. You know what I'm saying? I don't even want to have to say that. You know what I'm saying? Because that's not the point at all. The point. The point is the um, abundance of diverse choices that are
mhm,
actually there
yeah.
to that people things that people need to engage in to create a vibrant village. And I'm using that deliberately too, to talk about a certain scale, right, of interaction and integration and connectivity. Um, that there are all kinds of things that people can be doing to be a participant. If we're talking about modernity in in contemporary world culture. You know. Um, so yeah, how great to have Dr. Simmons in, how great. Um, and
Yes.
to the other piece, throwing this in, and then I am turning off the volume. But the other piece where he was, oh, actually, we did talk about that, but just going back to this coming out of the lone hero, that lone hero trope, in that's in everything, you know, in coming back to um, the communal vision of accomplishment, as he's talking about. I'm not out here. Yes, I have a staff. I have this. What? But it's not all. Everybody is integrated in this process of make pushing this research of making this happen.
Right.
Also the way he described himself. He's I can't do the sports references. You'll remember the sports references that he made. But I'm not a Kobe Bryant. He didn't say that. He made some other reference that I don't know.
Michael Jordan, but yes,
Okay, Michael Jordan. Okay. But right,
but
so
the analogy works though, right? He's yeah,
yes, okay. I'm trying. But you know what I mean.
yeah,
But yeah, just in terms of stepping away from the um, at least American contemporary product oriented and everything that is wrong with the heroism, and the individuation, you know,
yeah,
where he's able to say, um, yeah, he says, I'm not a Michael Jordan, but I'm at least a so and so. And
yeah.
that is what
Because even
makes it happen.
coordinates to the team,
Right.
which is it's interesting because so much, a couple of the most popular shows, at least for some time, um, that had a little science in them, though they're propaganda, right, or the CSI series, right,
Right.
and it was
Absolutely.
clear that they were working as a team, right, and it,
Yes.
in order to do the forensic science, right, as part of the investigation. Um,
And I might insert, hold
so,
your thoughts.
how much that team effort, or the reality of the team research resonated with the audience, hard to say, right, but
Yeah.
there it's being demonstrated for you in a way that it ordinarily isn't, right? There's a lead, whomever, forensic sciences, but
Yes.
it's a team effort, um,
Yes.
in popular culture
Yes.
for a
Um,
cop show, again, right?
yeah, right. Everything in the name of the cop show, but right, an example of collective work and
Right,
responsibility
as opposed to
made.
some of the other science fiction type shows where it is often, often a singular genius, right? Um, I,
Yes.
I guess
Yes.
something like the Star Trek universe
Right.
gives you that example of a team working together, the engineers and the science officers. But
Absolutely.
ordinarily, it is that mythic,
Right.
singular genius, right? Who's
Right.
maybe a singular genius and his teacher, maybe, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So we probably you always get back to the what Plato, Aristotle, Socrates dynamic, probably always
Yeah,
replicating that one way or another.
yeah, one way
Um,
or another, right?
but the something that came to mind to bring up is also young people in the wake of that spate of forensic science shows. A lot of young people were interested in became interested in forensic science
Forensic science, yes.
because there it is. And so you heard young people saying, I would like to do forensic science. I want to be a
I
forensic scientist. I want to,
remember vividly, right? Yes, exactly. The number of students who were looking at, during the heyday of the CSI
right.
television series. Yeah, yeah, exactly. Lots of folks were. I think I want to do forensic science. Exactly.
Hmm. So right on. Here we are, almost an hour and a half. We're in
Yes,
position to not be here for 2 hours.
yes. Well, we don't know we're not trying to be here for 2 hours, right? And we could, what, an hour and a half is good. Um, I would just, add that it is, well, if what I mentioned near the end of our conversation with Glenn, from the beginning, and certainly during the campaign, but programmatically from the beginning, right? It's that this regime, um, the second Trump term, has made pointed attacks on the various intellectual sectors of the society. The we see the the threatening, right, of prominent universities, the threats of pulling more funding through these investigations around uh, questions of diversity, equity, and inclusion on the campuses, as
Mhm.
well as those academic disciplines in the ethnic studies, critical studies, cultural studies that challenge there the notions of a glorious America or whatever, right? Or that raise critical questions about social relations and the history of this country.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, we see, the attacks on the arts. I mean, the takeover of the Kennedy Center was a signal of that, and the claim that
Mm.
or the promise, right, of art that again
Mm.
celebrates this new golden age that has been announced, right? But again,
Mhm.
that's going to, what we can expect um, is, again, attacks on art that is challenging in any kind of way, and on the institutions um, that provide a platform. So we see, there was this performative congressional hearing, I believe, yesterday, right, with that is bringing, raising questions about how NPR and PBS and the
Yes.
Corporation for Public Broadcasting are using, federal funds. The you know, you know, asserting that there's no space, right? They're trying to close up the space for the other narratives, right? Other experiences that represent various, minority experiences or marginal stories of marginalized people, or even just, challenging art, right? Whatever the politics of the art might be, and that control of memory that both, art looking both forward and backward, right? And the arts can represent, and the universities can represent the attack on journalism, which has been ongoing, right? And the threats of suing, the major platforms, corporate owned as they are, but
Mhm.
nonetheless, um,
Mhm.
when they're doing their jobs, right, a place that should offer some kind of um, accountability, right, to those
Mhm.
in power,
Mhm.
and law firms. And again, and of course, we know lawyers are defamed forever, right? But it matters that we have, heard over the last 40 plus years, constant attacks on teachers and professors,
Mhm.
constant attacks on lawyers, um, particularly not just the criminal defense lawyers, but those the tort lawyers and the ones who represent the class action lawsuits,
Mm.
etc., and
Mm.
attacks on journalism,
Yes. Mhm.
sowing
Mm.
those seeds of distrust
Mhm.
among people who are encouraging a citizenry to think critically about the situation, about their leaders, and to
Mhm.
protect their rights, right? To
Mhm.
be able to interpret and
Mhm.
protect them and represent them in
Mhm.
legal situations. And,
Mhm.
that too is part of the attack, a part of the playbook, right? To defame these professions in the minds of people, to plant those seeds of doubt, like they plant seeds of doubt about scientific
Mhm,
research
mhm,
and
mhm,
scientific data.
mhm. Which is very different even I'm sorry, you done?
Well,
Go
no, yeah, I'm done.
Yeah, very different than, um, criticizing the institutions of critique, you know,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
holding them accountable to a standard. It's much different, sowing seeds of doubt about the credibility of the institutions themselves is a much different thing than being
Hmm.
right, than holding those institutions to account to
Hmm.
to the ideal of what those institutions are supposed to represent. So, you know what I'm saying? So at
Hmm.
no point should media be the enemy of the people, but one might discover among uh, journalistic outlets or media outlets a failure to reach the standard that's set, but not
Hmm.
there's a problem with the institution, you know. Um, just, just a very different notion, a very different notion. And something that also speaks to something that significant to me that Glenn talked about in terms of in um, scientific publication and research and doing all that it takes even to get funding to pursue or whatnot, many levels of scrutiny that a proposed study goes through, you know. Um, and, scrutiny is different than surveillance, you know? So just these functions, these terms that
Hmm.
might at the surface seem similar or seem to be the same thing, and yet they are not, and yet they are not. Um, yeah, democracy is a tool toward for a justice in a just society. Democratization, and expanding what that means, what it really means, expanding the notion of what that really means, because still for so many of us, the knee jerk is you hear democracy, you think vote, you thinking about enfranchisement, and it's something
Hmm.
so much broader, and so many things contribute to an actual sharing of power.
I think that's a good place to close. So we will be back next week. Are we continue? We know. Well, are we continuing on the thread? This attack on, and again, the sort of the backwards looking character of the political moment.
Mm-hmm.
And so we can talk maybe further about that. Yeah, I keep hearing our beloved Baba,
Yeah.
um, Ronald Preston in my ear, the difference between conservatism and reaction, right? And this is a moment of reaction. These are reactionaries, conservatives, yeah, but reactionaries and going beyond. Just they aren't trying to conserve it, right? They're trying to break it all down to
Mm-hmm.
remake it into the ethno state of their dreams. Um,
Mm-hmm.
you know, a, a they're trying to revive the yeah the
Mm-hmm.
really the colonial relations of the past and all the
Mm-hmm.
various
Mm-hmm.
settler states around the world, of which the United States is the paragon. Um, and and the recognition, there is, I think, a recognition, so maybe we can talk about that too. But yeah, that's what this whole thing has been about, right? The rights war on modernity.
Mm-hmm.
Modernity itself, we know, being quite complicated and
Mhm.
um, a era of great erasure, right? Erasure of peoples and traditions and landscapes, etc. But
Mhm.
also this era of a particular kind, a move toward democratization.
Mhm.
Um, and again, a move toward, and including the democratization of the largesse produced by the socially, a more effective distribution of the socially produced wealth that's privately and individually owned. Um, that has been one of the demands, um, and moves toward that,
Mhm.
knowing it's all complicated. And
Mhm.
this moment of reaction is a backward looking moment,
Mhm.
in the sciences and
Mhm.
other areas. Um,
Mhm. Mhm.
so we'll continue our discussion. Uh, yeah, well, folks, we'll do the things, right? If you're watching this or when you watch this on YouTube, please do subscribe if you haven't already. Be sure to like this episode. Can I call it that? Right? This conversation,
Do we have we do have music, yeah. Okay.
and share. Please share. And we will be back next Thursday. We expect to be back at our usual time, 7 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time. Um, yeah. Good night, y'all.
Good night, y'all.